The inspector, when he arrived some 40 minutes later, proved to be a stolid man of the type that the English countryside produces with admirable regularity, competent without being imaginative, thorough without being particularly perceptive, and possessed of that peculiar authority that comes from a uniform and the unshakable belief that most deaths are exactly what they appear to be. His name was Hardcastle, and he regarded Whimsy's involvement with the expression of a railway official who has just discovered that someone has rearranged his timetables without authorization. Nevertheless, the Reverend's insistence that Lord Peter be consulted had apparently carried sufficient weight, and Hardcastle now stood in the study with his constable, examining the 3 teacups with the sort of skepticism generally reserved for reports of flying saucers or spontaneous human combustion. "Natural causes," Hardcastle repeated, with the air of a man restating an obvious mathematical fact. "Dr. Merriweather examined the body not 2 hours ago. 62 years old, considerable strain on the heart visible in his appearance, been complaining of palpitations to half the parish. Death occurred between 2:30 and 3 o'clock, most likely. The housekeeper found him in his chair at 3:30, still warm to the touch. Nothing whatsoever to suggest anything but the expected conclusion of an impending cardiac event." He paused, watching Whimsy examine the teacups with an intensity that seemed to annoy him. "The man was marked for death, if you take my meaning, Lord Peter. The wonder is not that he died, but that he lasted as long as he did." "Marked for death," Whimsy repeated softly, as though tasting the phrase. "What a curious way of expressing the matter, Inspector. Most of us, I suppose, are marked for death from the moment we draw our first breath. It is only the method and timing that remain open to debate." He set down the first cup, then the second, and finally lifted the third, the one intended for the deceased clergyman, bringing it to his nose with the delicate precision of a connoisseur sampling vintage wine. His expression did not change, but there was a fractional pause before he set it down again and turned to the Reverend with eyes that had suddenly become considerably sharper than they had been moments before. "Tell me, Reverend, you mentioned that Cousin Mabel is from London. Has she been from London her entire life, or is she a London acquisition of more recent vintage? And more specifically, what was her relationship to your late wife before arriving here to manage the household?" The Reverend blinked at this apparent non sequitur, his clerical composure momentarily displaced by confusion. "Mabel is Eleanor's cousin, not mine. They were close as girls, though they had drifted into correspondence-only terms over the past 2 decades. After Eleanor's diagnosis became certain, Mabel wrote offering to come and manage the household, citing her knowledge of London medicine and her ability to ensure that Eleanor received the best possible care. She arrived 6 weeks ago, and she proved invaluable during the final weeks. I do not see what bearing this has upon the third teacup," Whimsy finished, his tone making it clear that he was not actually asking a question. "No, perhaps you do not. Yet bearing it has nonetheless. Inspector Hardcastle, I take it you have secured Reverend Thripp's cottage and permitted no one to disturb it beyond the necessary examination by your medical examiner." "Naturally," Hardcastle responded, his irritation now quite visible. "This is not my first investigation, Lord Peter. The cottage is locked and sealed pending further examination, though there is nothing to examine. Natural causes. The man is dead. The cause is evident, and unless you possess some evidence to the contrary, which I note you do not, I see no reason to delay the inevitable conclusion." "Inevitable," Whimsy mused, walking to the window where the November rain continued its steady percussion against the glass. "What an extraordinarily final word you employ, Inspector. Inevitable conclusions tend to be the enemy of truth, in my experience. They are comfortable things, inevitable conclusions. They settle the mind and permit one to file away one's cases and move on to the next crisis. They are also, I might add, precisely what a competent killer would wish for, which is rather the problem, is it not?" He turned back to face both men, and there was in his expression now that quality of detached amusement that seemed to contain within it something rather frightening. Suppose, merely as a logical exercise, that someone wished to murder Reverend Thripp with minimal risk of detection. Suppose further that this person possessed knowledge of the Reverend's cardiac weakness and access to the Reverend's household. How very convenient that a death from natural causes could occur, at precisely the moment when 3 cups of tea had been distributed throughout the vicarage, with only one of them reaching its intended destination. How extraordinarily convenient that the Reverend Thripp's housekeeper had received word only at the last moment that he would be delayed, thus ensuring that the 3rd cup would sit unnoticed for the better part of an hour before his absence became remarkable. The silence that followed this observation was substantial and uncomfortable. Hardcastle's face had taken on the particular hue of a man who suspects he has been made to appear foolish without quite understanding how it had been accomplished. The Reverend had gone very pale, his fingers gripping the arms of his chair with considerable force. It was into this silence that a sound intruded from somewhere beyond the study, a sharp, crystalline sound like breaking glass or perhaps the sharp intake of breath quickly stifled. Both men looked toward the door, but Whimsy remained facing the window, his expression utterly unchanged. "I believe," he said conversationally, "that would be Cousin Mabel, who has just discovered that her carefully orchestrated misfortune has not concluded precisely as she had anticipated. Inspector Hardcastle, I suggest you post your constable immediately outside the morning room, where that lady is presently taking her delayed tea. She will attempt to leave the house within the next 2 minutes, and I rather doubt that her destination was anywhere she had previously mentioned to the Reverend." Inspector Hardcastle required only a moment to overcome his professional pride sufficiently to act upon Whimsy's directive, barking instructions to his constable with the brisk efficiency of a man who, whatever his limitations in deductive reasoning, understood the mechanics of authority and obedience. The constable departed with gratifying alacrity, and within seconds the sound of footsteps in the corridor beyond suggested that some manner of interruption to Cousin Mabel's afternoon repose was indeed in progress. Whimsy remained at the window, his posture suggesting complete indifference to the developing drama, though his reflection in the glass betrayed a certain intensity of focus that belied his apparent calm. The Reverend, meanwhile, had risen from his chair and was pacing the study with the agitated movements of a man whose entire understanding of domestic harmony had been suddenly and violently rearranged. "I cannot believe it," the Reverend was saying, his voice rising with each iteration. Mabel, who nursed Eleanor through her final weeks, who showed such tenderness, such genuine Christian charity. She was there at the end, Lord Peter, holding Eleanor's hand when the pain became unbearable. I saw her weeping at the graveside. I simply cannot accept that such a woman could be capable of— He stopped abruptly, as though the full implications of what he was about to articulate had only just become clear to him. But why? What possible motive could she possess? She has no claim upon this vicarage, no inheritance awaits her. She is, by all accounts, a woman of modest but sufficient means. The crime makes no sense whatever. On the contrary, Whimsy said, turning from the window with an expression of mild correction, the crime makes excellent sense once one ceases to think of it in terms of conventional motives and begins instead to consider the psychological architecture of those involved. Tell me, Reverend, during those final weeks of your wife's illness, who managed the household finances? Who held the authority over domestic decisions, the engagement of servants, the ordering of supplies, the management of your wife's medical care? The Reverend's face underwent a peculiar transformation, something between comprehension and revulsion. "Mabel," he said slowly, "Eleanor was in considerable pain, and I was not equipped to manage both her care and the parish duties. Mabel offered, and I accepted. I gave her access to the household accounts, authorized her to make decisions regarding Eleanor's treatment. She consulted with physicians in London, arranged for various treatments that were not readily available locally. I trusted her completely." "Yes," Whimsy agreed softly, "I rather imagine you did. And now, if you will permit me to make an educated guess at the contents of those household accounts during the past 6 weeks, I suspect you will discover that Cousin Mabel has been conducting a rather elaborate system of embezzlement, authorizing payments to London physicians who do not exist, ordering medicines that were never delivered, arranging treatments that never occurred, all of it conducted with sufficient plausibility that a grieving man, focused upon his wife's suffering rather than the mechanics of her care, would have neither the attention nor the inclination to scrutinize the details with appropriate skepticism. Before the Reverend could respond to this devastating revelation, the door to the study opened with sufficient force to suggest that Cousin Mabel had made a determined attempt to pass through it despite the constable's best efforts at prevention. She was, Whimsy observed with professional interest, a woman of perhaps 53 or 54 years, with the sort of face that suggested she had once been attractive before disappointment had settled into her features like sediment in still water. Her hair was dark, streaked with grey that she appeared to have abandoned attempting to conceal, and her eyes possessed that particular quality of intelligence combined with desperation that often characterized individuals who had reached the limits of their capacity for self-deception. She was breathing heavily, and there was in her demeanor the barely suppressed panic of someone who perceived the walls of her carefully constructed deception collapsing with alarming rapidity. "I demand to know what this is about," she said, her voice maintaining a veneer of indignation that was rendered rather transparent by the tremor beneath it. "I have done nothing wrong. I came here at the Reverend's request to care for my cousin. I remained after her death to ensure a proper transition in household management. If there are irregularities in the accounts, they are due to Eleanor's medical expenses, which were considerable, and which I managed to the very best of my ability." She turned to the Reverend, and there was in her expression something almost pleading. "You know me, Charles. You know what Eleanor's illness meant, how desperately we tried every treatment, every remedy that might offer hope. Surely you do not believe I would do anything to harm you or your household?" "Harm," Whimsy interjected pleasantly, "is perhaps too crude a term for what you have done, Miss Mabel. Embezzlement implies financial crime, and indeed that is part of your enterprise. But the murder of Reverend Thripp suggests something considerably more elaborate. You see, the Reverend here consulted with Reverend Thripp regarding financial irregularities he had begun to notice in the accounts. Nothing substantial, merely enough to create a vague disquiet. The Reverend Thripp, being of that particular variety of clergyman who takes himself rather seriously regarding moral rectitude, indicated that he intended to review the accounts himself and determine whether the vicarage had been subjected to financial malfeasance. That would have been inconvenient for you, would it not? A murder committed via poisoned tea and disguised as natural causes would eliminate the threat rather efficiently." Mabel's face had gone very white, and she swayed slightly, as though the room had begun to tilt beneath her feet. When she spoke again, her voice had lost all pretense of indignation. "Eleanor was dying anyway," she said flatly. "The physicians said so. 6 months at most. I merely accelerated the inevitable while ensuring that her final weeks were comfortable and that my future was secure." She would have understood. She always understood me. Inspector Hardcastle, moving with purpose, produced a set of handcuffs and began to recite the legal formulation regarding arrest and the right to counsel, his professional composure apparently quite restored now that events had progressed to the satis. Yingli concrete stage of criminal apprehension. Whimsy, watching this procedure with an expression of detached observation, moved toward the table where the 3 teacups remained their silent vigil. The constable, responding to Hardcastle's silent gesture, took hold of Mabel's arm with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this particular task on multiple previous occasions, and began to lead her toward the door with a firmness that suggested he harbored no illusions regarding her willingness to cooperate. Yet Whimsy raised a hand with a gesture that, though possessing no official authority whatsoever, seemed to carry sufficient weight to cause the constable to pause. "One moment, Inspector," Whimsy said, his tone suggesting that what he was about to articulate was of considerably greater importance than the mere physical removal of a confessed murderer from a vicarage study. "Before Miss Mabel departs for her appointment with the criminal justice system, I suspect the Reverend deserves a somewhat more complete accounting of the mechanisms by which his wife's death was hastened and his household finances were systematically depleted. The third teacup, after all, tells only part of the story. The fuller narrative requires considerably more elaborate explanation, and I find that individuals in Miss Mabel's current circumstances are often remarkably forthcoming when confronted with the precise architecture of their own deceptions." Mabel's expression underwent a subtle transformation, something between resignation and a peculiar species of relief, as though the burden of maintaining her carefully constructed falsehoods had become so substantial that their collapse represented a perverse form of liberation. She sank into the chair that the Reverend had recently vacated, and her gaze, when it lifted to meet Whimsy's, possessed a quality of awful clarity. That suggested she had, in some profound sense, been waiting for exactly this moment of exposure and reckoning. "Eleanor was already dying," Mabel began, her voice carrying the flat, mechanical quality of a confession, delivered not to the living, but to some invisible tribunal of judgment. The physicians in London were quite explicit on this point. 6 months, possibly less. The pain would increase incrementally, the indignities would accumulate, and at the end there would be nothing but suffering with no possibility of amelioration. When I arrived here to care for her, I saw what was coming, and I saw as well the opportunity that her death presented. She paused, and in that pause there seemed to reside all the desperation of a woman who had spent her life watching others inherit security, while she herself remained perpetually on the margins of respectability and financial stability. "I have never married, Lord Peter. I have no children, no family beyond Charles and Eleanor. I spent 30 years as a governess, then as a companion to elderly women, scraping together a pittance that barely sustains me. Eleanor had always been kind, always remembered me at Christmas and on my birthday, but kindness is not security. Security requires certainty, requires assets, requires the sort of financial foundation that permits one to move through the world without constant fear of destitution. "You forged the medical expenses," Whimsy said, it being not so much a question as a confirmation of deduced fact. "Eleanor required legitimate treatment, which you provided at considerable cost, but you also created phantom physicians, imaginary medicines, treatments that never occurred. You presented the Reverend with invoices for services rendered, all of which were entirely fabricated, and all of which gradually accumulated into a substantial sum that you diverted into accounts established, under various false names. The embezzlement was elaborate and clever, but it would have been discovered eventually, particularly once Eleanor's death made scrutiny of the financial arrangements inevitable." "Yes," Mabel confirmed, her voice dropping to barely more than a whisper. The Reverend's grief would eventually fade sufficiently that he would begin to ask questions. He would examine the accounts, discover the inconsistencies, and realize what I had done. Even if he chose mercy over prosecution, and Charles is kind enough that he might have, my reputation would be destroyed. No family would employ me, no household would accept me. I would be cast out, and at my age, with my history, there would be no recovery from such a fall." "So you required an additional layer of protection," Whimsy continued, his tone carrying neither judgment nor sympathy, but rather the clinical precision of a man reconstructing a mathematical problem. The Reverend mentioned to Reverend Thripp his vague disquiet regarding the accounts. Reverend Thripp, being a man of austere moral principles, declared his intention to examine the financial records himself. He was, in short, a threat to your entire enterprise. You could not afford to allow him access to those accounts, because once he began to scrutinize them, the embezzlement would become apparent even to the most casual observer. So you decided to eliminate him. "I obtained the poison from a gardener in London," Mabel said with the dull delivery of a woman who has passed, beyond shame, into some realm of absolute candor. "Oleander extract, quite potent, quite detectable if one were specifically looking for it, but easily disguised as a heart attack if one were not. I had been studying the Reverend's habits for weeks. I knew that Eleanor's cousin took tea on Tuesday afternoons, that he was prone to cardiac distress, that he lived alone with only an elderly housekeeper who was largely deaf and would hear nothing amiss. I prepared the poison carefully, measuring it with precision. When the tea was made on Tuesday, I added a small quantity of the extract to the third cup, the one intended for Reverend Thripp. The delay in his arrival was providential. I had not anticipated it, but it created the perfect obscurity. The cup sat for nearly an hour, giving the poison time to settle, to become thoroughly incorporated into the liquid. When he finally arrived and drank it, his death would appear entirely natural, the inevitable conclusion of a weak heart subjected to stress. The Reverend made a sound that was neither quite word nor quite sob, a manifestation of the profound betrayal of trust that Mabel's confession represented. Whimsy, observing this display with the detached sympathy of one who had witnessed human betrayal in its myriad forms, moved to the table and carefully lifted the third teacup, examining its contents in the fading afternoon light that filtered through the study window. The liquid, now completely cooled, possessed a faint amber tinge that suggested the presence of additional compounds beyond the standard properties of Earl Grey. The remaining poison in this cup would have been quite sufficient to kill a man several times over, Whimsy observed quietly. Inspector Hardcastle, I suspect you will wish to have this analyzed by your toxicologist. The evidence is quite thorough, and the conclusion quite inescapable. Miss Mabel has, in effect, constructed her own confession through the mechanism of the third teacup, the one that was never consumed, the one that remains as silent testimony to premeditation, calculation, and the extraordinary lengths to which desperation will drive even otherwise ordinary individuals. The removal of Cousin Mabel from the vicarage study proceeded with the sort of awed, early efficiency that characterizes the machinery of law enforcement once it has been set in proper motion. The constable, having received explicit instruction from Inspector Hardcastle regarding the necessity of preserving the teacup as evidence, took possession of it with the reverence one might typically reserve for holy relics, placing it within a carefully prepared receptacle designed for the transportation of materials requiring forensic examination. Mabel herself departed without further resistance, her earlier defiance having evaporated entirely into a kind of hollow acceptance that suggested she had, in some obscure psychological sense, been relieved of an intolerable burden through the simple mechanism of confession and apprehension. The Reverend watched her go with an expression that transcended mere shock or betrayal, and seemed instead to occupy some liminal space between incomprehension and a terrible dawning recognition of the elaborate deceptions that had been perpetrated beneath the veneer of familial obligation and Christian charity. Once the immediate machinery of arrest had been set in motion, and the constable had departed with his evidence in tow, Hardcastle turned to Whimsy with an expression that mingled professional gratitude with the lingering irritation of a man who had been proven incorrect in his initial assessment of events. The poison in the cup, the confession regarding the embezzlement, the premeditation involved in securing the oleander extract from London. It is all quite damning, the inspector acknowledged, his tone suggesting a reconciliation to the reality that what had appeared to be a straightforward death from natural causes had in fact constituted an elaborate murder masked by circumstantial coincidence and the convenient weakness of the victim's constitution. Yet I confess, I remain uncertain regarding certain aspects of your deduction, Lord Peter. How precisely did you determine that the poison had been administered through the medium of the tea? The symptoms of oleander extract poisoning are not dissimilar to those of acute cardiac failure, and the visual inspection of the liquid itself provided no obvious indication of contamination. Whimsy, having settled himself into the chair vacated by Mabel with the air of a man preparing to deliver a lecture rather than a mere explanation, smiled with that particular quality of condescension that characterized his interactions with individuals who, while respectable in their professional competence, lacked the imaginative reach required for truly sophisticated deduction. The poison itself was, as you note, remarkably difficult to detect through ordinary visual means, he began, producing a fresh cigarette with the deliberate ceremony he seemed to reserve for moments of exposition. However, the botanical origin of oleander extract carries with it certain olfactory properties that, while subtle, are not entirely imperceptible to an individual possessed of a suitably refined sense of smell. I detected a faint trace of bitter almond, mingled with something vaguely reminiscent of cherry blossoms, the characteristic signature of compounds derived from oleander. The scent was masked somewhat by the Earl Grey, but not sufficiently to escape detection upon close examination. Moreover, the precise arrangement of the three cups presented a temporal puzzle that required explanation. The Reverend, who had regained sufficient composure to participate in the conversation, leaned forward with the intensity of a man grasping at straws of understanding in an effort to comprehend how the household he had believed stable and secure had in fact been constructed upon foundations of elaborate fraud and murderous intent. "I do not follow you," he said quietly. "What pooh? Did the arrangement of the cups present? Surely the mechanism was simple enough. The poison was added to the third cup. The cup remained unconsumed due to the delay in Reverend Thripp's arrival, and thus the evidence of the crime was preserved through the happenstance of circumstance rather than through any deliberate design on Mabel's part." "Precisely," Whimsy said, rising from his chair and moving once more to the window where the November rain had begun to acquire the darker, heavier quality that precedes evening twilight. "And therein lies the peculiarity that transformed a seemingly natural death into a matter requiring investigation. You see, Reverend, Cousin Mabel is an intelligent woman. Her embezzlement scheme demonstrates a capacity for elaborate planning and systematic deception that extends well beyond the capabilities of the merely ordinarily dishonest. Yet in the matter of Reverend Thripp's murder, she appears to have relied entirely upon chance. She poisoned a cup of tea and then simply hoped that the intended victim would consume it before its contents could be examined or questioned. This represents a fundamental inconsistency with her demonstrated character and capabilities. Hardcastle, who had been following this exposition with the furrowed brow of a man attending a lecture delivered in a language he understood only imperfectly, interjected with a note of querulous skepticism. "Are you suggesting, Lord Peter, that Miss Mabel's plan was more elaborate than she herself admitted during her confession, that her explanation of the crime was somehow incomplete or deliberately misleading?" "Not misleading precisely," Whimsy corrected, turning from the window to face both men with an expression that suggested he was about to deliver information of considerably greater complexity than what had thus far been articulated. "Rather, I suspect her confessio. N addressed only the murder of Reverend Thripp and the embezzlement scheme, but failed to encompass the earlier and considerably more significant crime that precipitated the necessity of both. You see, the question that requires answering is not simply, how was Reverend Thripp poisoned, but rather, why did Cousin Mabel feel compelled to murder him at this particular moment, under these particular circumstances? The answer to that larger question requires us to examine not merely the mechanics of the crime, but the psychology that motivated it. The Reverend's face had undergone yet another transformation, this time suggesting a horrifying dawning of comprehension. "Eleanor," he said, the name emerging as barely more than a whisper. "You are suggesting that Eleanor's death was not precisely as we believed it to be, that Mabel did not merely accelerate the inevitable, but rather created the circumstances through which the inevitable became certain." Whimsy's silence in response to this observation was itself eloquent, suggesting a confirmation that required no verbal articulation. The Reverend rose from his chair with the movements of a man bearing a weight considerably greater than his physical frame could comfortably support, and moved toward the door with the apparent intention of departing the study entirely. Yet his footsteps slowed as he reached the threshold, and when he turned back to face Whimsy, there was in his expression something that transcended mere grief or betrayal, and seemed instead to represent a fundamental rupture in his understanding of the universe and his place within it. The Reverend's hand, gripping the doorframe with visible force, trembled in a manner that suggested his equilibrium, both physical and psychological, had been severely compromised by the implications of Whimsy's observation. "You must tell me," he said, his voice carrying the spirit quality of a man confronting truths so fundamentally devastating that their articulation seemed almost preferable to the alternative of enduring them in silent speculation. "I must know whether my wife's death was merely the merciful acceleration of an inevitable conclusion, or whether it represented something considerably more sinister. I must know this, Lord Peter, or the remainder of my life will be consumed by the corrosive uncertainty of what I do not fully comprehend." Whimsy regarded the Reverend with an expression that suggested a particular species of compassion, not the sentimental variety that offers false comfort, but rather the austere sympathy of one who recognizes that some knowledge once obtained cannot be subsequently relinquished or forgotten. "Sit down, Reverend," he said quietly, gesturing toward the chair the clergyman had recently vacated. "Inspector Hardcastle, I suspect you will wish to summon your medical examiner and request that he review his initial examination of your wife's body with considerably greater attention to detail than he appears to have devoted to Reverend Thripp's death. There are poisons, you see, that mimic the symptoms of advanced cancer with remarkable fidelity, particularly when administered in carefully calibrated doses over an extended period. The progression appears natural. The suffering seems consistent with the disease rather than with deliberate poisoning, and the final conclusion, death from cardiac collapse secondary to systemic deterioration, appears entirely consonant with the apparent medical reality." Inspector Hardcastle's expression underwent a transformation that suggested the full scope of the criminal enterprise was only now becoming apparent to his professionally trained but fundamentally linear mind. "You are suggesting that Miss Mabel poisoned the wife as well?" he asked, his tone carrying the quality of a man articulating a proposition so outrageous that he could scarcely credit his own words. That she did not merely accelerate Eleanor's death, but actually orchestrated it through the administration of some substance that would simulate the progression of her existing disease. "Not merely suggests," Whimsy corrected, moving to the side table where Mrs. Hartley's carefully arranged teacups had begun their silent testimony to betrayal. "Consider the timeline, if you will. Cousin Mabel arrives at the vicarage approximately 6 weeks prior to Eleanor's death, ostensibly summoned by the Reverend's wife in response to her advancing illness. Eleanor was initially expected to survive for 6 months or perhaps longer, yet within a mere 6 weeks her condition deteriorates precipitously, and she departs this mortal coil with a speed that, while perhaps not entirely inconsistent with an aggressive terminal illness, appears notably accelerated from the prognostications of the London physicians who had examined her prior to Mabel's arrival. Furthermore, it was during precisely these 6 weeks that the elaborate embezzlement scheme was orchestrated. The phantom medical expenses, the fictional treatments, the accumulation of funds diverted into accounts established under false names. All of this required time, access to financial records, and the certainty that the Reverend would be too consumed with his wife's immediate care to scrutinize such matters with appropriate rigor. The Reverend had resumed his seat, and his complexion had taken on a pallor that suggested the conversation was exacting a considerable physical toll upon his already compromised constitution. "But why?" he asked, the word emerging as barely more than a gasp. "If Eleanor was already dying, why poison her? Mabel could have simply waited, provided adequate care, and achieved the same result through the simple mechanism of natural disease progression. Because, Whimsy said, with the precision of a man delivering a verdict, waiting represented an unacceptable risk to Miss Mabel's enterprise. Eleanor was a woman of considerable intelligence, and despite her advancing illness, she retained the capacity for observation and the authority to question household expenditures. Moreover, the Reverend, once his wife's death had occurred, and his immediate grief had begun to fade, would have possessed the leisure to scrutinize the financial arrangements with considerable attention to detail. Mabel required Eleanor's death to occur swiftly, within the window of time during which the Reverend's grief would be most acute and his capacity for critical examination most severely compromised. She also required the death to appear entirely natural, entirely consistent with the disease process, entirely free of any suspicion of external intervention. The oleander extract, administered in carefully measured doses through the medium of Eleanor's tea, or perhaps dissolved in some medicinal preparation that Mabel provided under the guise of palliative care, would gradually accumulate in the body and produce symptoms virtually indistinguishable from the progression of advanced cancer. Inspector Hardcastle, having absorbed this exposition, rose from his chair with the determined manner of a man whose sense of professional duty had been sharply activated by the realization that his initial investigation had been profoundly incomplete. "I shall require the exhumation order," he said to no one in particular, his eyes fixed upon some middle distance suggesting internal calculation regarding the legal procedures necessary to obtain such authorization. "The toxicologist must examine the remains, must identify the presence of oleander extract or whatever other substance was employed. We must be absolutely certain before proceeding with additional charges. But if what Lord Peter suggests is accurate, then Miss Mabel is not merely guilty of embezzlement and the murder of Reverend Thrip, but also of the premeditated murder of her own cousin, a crime considerably more elaborate and psychologically complex than the second murder, inasmuch as it required extended access to the victim, sustained deception, and the maintenance of a false persona of devoted familial care. Whimsy nodded slowly, as though acknowledging that Hardcastle had at last grasped the fundamental architecture of the crime and its implications. "The question that will require careful investigation," he observed, "is whether Miss Mabel's initial intention was embezzlement alone, with Eleanor S. death representing merely an expedient means of protecting her enterprise, or whether the murder was premeditated from the moment of her arrival. The distinction, while perhaps subtle, carries considerable weight regarding the nature of her criminality and the psychological framework within which such crimes are habitually committed. In either case, however, the mechanism remains consistent, the motive is clear, and the evidence, once properly examined, should prove quite damning. The machinery of official investigation, once set in motion with the particular gravity that attends the discovery of premeditated murder rather than mere circumstantial homicide, proceeded with a methodical precision that seemed to partition the vicarage into distinct zones of criminal inquiry. Inspector Hardcastle, having departed to arrange for the exhumation order and the requisite toxicological analysis, left behind a constable tasked with securing the household and ensuring that no materials pertaining to the crime were disturbed or removed. Whimsy, meanwhile, had settled himself in the study with the air of a man whose work, though substantially complete, required a final period of reflection and consolidation before conclusions could be deemed satisfactorily established. The Reverend, having received permission to retire to his chambers, had departed with the shuffling gait of one bearing a burden that exceeded the capacity of his physical frame, leaving Whimsy alone save for the constable's distant presence and the steady percussion of November rain against the study windows. It was approximately 1 hour subsequent to Hardcastle's departure that Whimsy rose from his contemplative posture, and with the deliberate movements of a man engaged in a specific and purposeful investigation, began to examine the study with considerably greater attention to architectural and furnishing detail than would ordinarily be justified by mere aesthetic appreciation. He moved to the bookshelves with the focus of a bibliophile conducting research, his fingers trailing along the spines of various volumes, theological treatises, classical texts, a particularly worn copy of the Oxford Dictionary of Quotations, before his attention settled upon what appeared to be a false panel situated behind the lower row of books. The panel yielded to subtle pressure with the smooth mechanical precision of something that had been carefully constructed and frequently utilized, revealing a narrow cavity within which reposed a leather-bound journal and, rather more significantly, a series of financial documents that appeared to chronicle transactions of considerable irregularity. Whimsy extracted these materials with the reverence one might reserve for archaeological artifacts of substantial historical importance, and proceeded to examine them with an intensity of focus that suggested their contents were precisely what he had anticipated discovering. The journal, written in a hand that bore unmistakable similarity to the scry, P.T. Whimsy had observed in Mabel's earlier confession, detailed with remarkable candor the entire architecture of the criminal enterprise, the initial assessment of Eleanor's vulnerability, the calculation of her remaining lifespan, the determination that accelerating her death would provide cover for the embezzlement scheme, and the specific dosages of oleander extract that had been systematically administered over the course of 6 weeks. Yet it was not the confession itself that appeared to arrest Whimsy's attention, but rather the entries that preceded Eleanor's arrival at the vicarage, entries that dated back approximately 18 months and suggested a considerably more elaborate predatory pattern than had thus far been articulated. The constable, observing Whimsy's discovery of the hidden panel and its contents, immediately summoned Inspector Hardcastle by telephone, and within the space of approximately 40 minutes, the inspector had returned to the vicarage, accompanied by a sergeant tasked with photographic documentation of all relevant materials. Hardcastle's expression, upon reviewing the contents of Mabel's journal, underwent a transformation that suggested his initial comprehension of the case's complexity had been substantially exceeded by the reality that the documents now revealed. "There are others," he said quietly, his finger tracing entries that preceded Eleanor's illness by more than a year. Entries dating back approximately 2 years, describing meetings with various elderly women of modest but sufficient means. Descriptions of their health vulnerabilities, their financial circumstances, their family situations. This suggests a pattern of predatory behavior extending considerably beyond the Reverend's household, Whimsy concluded, his tone carrying neither surprise nor satisfaction, but rather the clinical acknowledgement of having precisely what had now been confirmed. Miss Mabel appears to have devoted the better part of 2 years to identifying vulnerable targets, elderly women, preferably possessed of some family connection or obligation that would justify her employment as a companion or caregiver, and sufficiently isolated that their deaths would be unlikely to prompt immediate investigation. Eleanor represents not her first victim, Inspector, but rather merely the culmination of a carefully orchestrated series of predatory crimes that have extended across multiple households and geographical locations. Hardcastle's complexion had assumed a grey tone that suggested the emotional toll of this expanded understanding of criminal depravity. "We must identify the other victims," he said, his voice carrying the particular urgency of a man recognizing that the scope of the investigation had suddenly become substantially more extensive and complex than had previously been apparent. "We must determine how many other women may have died under circumstances that were presumed natural, but which in fact constitute murder. We must examine the circumstances of each death, request exhumations, conduct toxicological analysis. This is not merely a matter of 2 murders, Lord Peter. This may constitute a sustained pattern of serial homicide extending across years and multiple jurisdictions." Whimsy, observing the inspector's dawning recognition of the full implications of Mabel's criminal enterprise, experienced a momentary flicker of something that might have been compassion, or might simply have been the professional satisfaction of seeing a complex puzzle successfully resolved according to logical principles. "The journal itself will provide substantial guidance regarding the identification of previous victims," he observed, gesturing toward the leather-bound volume with its careful documentation of pre-datary assessment and criminal achievement. Miss Mabel appears to have maintained meticulous records, a characteristic that, while extraordinarily foolish from a practical standpoint, will prove invaluable from the perspective of criminal investigation. She has, in effect, provided you with a comprehensive catalogue of her own crimes, complete with dates, locations, and victim identities. One suspects that the psychological gratification derived from maintaining such records outweighed her capacity for rational self-preservation and discretion. The Reverend, who had apparently heard the sounds of Hardcastle's return and subsequent conversation, had emerged from his chambers and now stood in the study doorway with an expression suggesting that the full magnitude of what had occurred beneath his roof had only now become apparent to his consciousness. "How many?" he asked quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "How many other women did she murder before she came to Eleanor? How many families does she have on her conscience before mine?" Whimsy turned to face the clergyman with an expression that contained within it something approaching genuine sympathy, tempered by the austere recognition that some questions admitted of no answer that could offer genuine consolation. "That, Reverend, is precisely the question that Inspector Hardcastle and his colleagues must now endeavour to answer through the systematic application of investigative procedure, forensic analysis, and coordination with law enforcement authorities across multiple jurisdictions. The answer, I fear, will prove considerably more extensive and considerably more troubling than any of us might wish. But answer it we shall, because Miss Mabel has, through her own meticulous documentation, ensured that her crimes will be neither forgotten nor overlooked. The subsequent investigation conducted with the methodical precision, that characterizes official police procedure when confronted with crimes of unusual complexity and extended duration, consumed the better part of 3 weeks and ultimately resulted in the identification of 7 additional victims spanning a period of approximately 4 years prior to Eleanor's death. The exhumation of Eleanor's remains confirmed the presence of oleander extract in concentrations sufficient to establish poisoning as the definitive cause of death, while similar toxicological analysis of 5 other previously interred women revealed comparable evidence of deliberate poisoning disguised as natural disease progression. 2 additional victims, whose remains had been cremated per the instructions of their families, could only be established as probable homicides through the detailed confession extracted from Mabel during her incarceration and the corroborating testimony of servants and family members who recalled the peculiar timing of deaths that had occurred shortly after Mabel's employment in their respective households. The pattern that emerged was one of calculated predation executed with a precision that suggested not the impulsive criminality of passion or circumstance, but rather the calculated methodology of an individual for whom murder had become a systematic professional enterprise, no different in its essential nature than any other form of carefully organized employment. Inspector Hardcastle, upon receiving confirmation of these findings from the Home Office Forensic Laboratory, had undergone a transformation in demeanor that suggested the weight of his expanded investigation had begun to exceed the emotional capacity of his previously routine professional experience. He appeared at the vicarage on a wet afternoon some 3 weeks subsequent to Mabel's initial arrest, his bearing suggesting the exhaustion of a man who had devoted every waking hour to the coordination of multiple investigations across 3 counties. Whimsy, who had remained in the vicarage as an informal consultant to the investigation, received him in the study where the 3 teacups had originally stood as silent witnesses to the unfolding catastrophe. The cups themselves had long since been removed as evidence, but Hardcastle appeared to perceive their spectral presence nonetheless, his gaze lingering upon the empty table, as though he could still observe the damning testimony that had initiated the entire investigative cascade. The Crown Prosecutor's Office has determined that we possess sufficient evidence to proceed with prosecution on all counts, Hardcastle reported, his voice carrying the particular flatness of a man delivering conclusions that offered no satisfaction and precious little resolution. The poisonings are established through toxicological analysis. The premeditation is documented in Mabel's own journal, and the financial crimes are thoroughly substantiated through the examination of bank records and property transfers. There will be no difficulty in securing convictions on all charges. Indeed, Mabel's legal representatives have indicated that she intends to enter guilty pleas across the board, thereby obviating the necessity of protracted trial proceedings. She appears to have abandoned all pretense of either innocence or rehabilitation. "Guilty pleas," Whimsy repeated, his tone suggesting a particular species of interest in this development. "That is somewhat unexpected, though perhaps not entirely surprising given the comprehensiveness of the evidence arrayed against her and the elaborate documentation she so conveniently preserved. One suspects that she has achieved a form of psychological reconciliation with her crimes, or perhaps has determined that the continued maintenance of her legal defense would constitute a further exercise in futile self-deception. Tell me, Inspector, has she provided any explanation for the motivations that animated such an extended and elaborate predatory campaign? Has she articulated any justification, however obscure or psychologically distorted, for the systematic elimination of women who had extended to her the hospitality of their households and the presumed security of familial connection? Hardcastle produced a small leather notebook from his jacket pocket and consulted its contents with the precision of a man who had learned to transcribe criminal testimony with meticulous accuracy. "She has made certain statements during questioning," he said slowly, as though selecting each word with considerable care. "Statements that our medical examiner and several alienists have examined with an eye toward determining whether they might constitute evidence of insanity or diminished responsibility. The substance of her confession is that she experienced a profound sense of injustice regarding her own circumstances, her never having married, her perpetual employment as a subordinate rather than as an independent agent, her awareness that she would never possess the security or the leisure that other women of superior social position took for granted. She describes observing elderly women in positions of comfort and stability and experiencing what she characterizes as an overwhelming compulsion to accelerate their transition from this world into the next, thereby liberating herself from the bonds of servile employment and acquisition of their modest but sufficient financial resources. Whimsy nodded slowly, as though this explanation confirmed certain psychological theories that he had previously entertained regarding the motivations of serial predators. A form of redistributive justice administered through the mechanism of murder, he observed. How very convenient that the execution of her murderous impulses coincided precisely with the advancement of her financial interests. One might almost believe that she had convinced herself of the moral rectitude of her enterprise, that she had somehow rationalized the systematic elimination of her victims as constituting a form of deserved punishment for their possession of advantages that she herself had been denied. It is a psychology not uncommon among individuals who have experienced prolonged deprivation or subordination, the conviction that the world has perpetrated an injustice against them that justifies, indeed that morally mandates, the perpetration of corresponding injustices against others. The alienists have employed more clinical terminology, Hardcastle said quietly, but the essential conclusion appears consistent with your assessment. They believe she suffers from a form of personality disorder that combines elements of narcissistic pathology with profound antisocial inclination. They suggest that she experienced no genuine remorse regarding her crimes, that her confession was motivated not by moral awakening, but rather by the simple recognition that concealment was no longer possible, and that she calculated that cooperation with the investigative authorities might result in some marginal mitigation of her ultimate sentencing. Whimsy rose from his chair and moved once more to the window, where the November rain had given way to a clearer evening, the Sussex landscape visible in the fading light with all its modest beauty and deceptive tranquillity. "And the Reverend?" he inquired, his tone suggesting that the welfare of the vicarage's principal resident had remained a matter of continuing concern. "How does he bear this extended revelation of the elaborate deceptions that have transpired beneath his roof?" "He has arranged for Eleanor's remains to receive a proper Christian burial," Hardcastle responded. "He has written to the families of the other victims, offering both apology and whatever financial restitution can be arranged through the disposition of Mabel's assets. He continues to perform his clerical duties, though the parish has noted a certain diminution in his previous vitality. I suspect the knowledge that his wife's death was not merely the natural consequence of disease, but rather the deliberate act of someone he extended employment and shelter to, has proven profoundly destabilizing to his previously secure understanding of the moral order of the universe. The trial of Miss Mabel Ashworth, as she was formally identified in the indictment documents, proceeded with a rapidity that suggested the Crown's prosecutors anticipated no serious impediment to the rapid processing of what had become, in the intervening weeks, one of the more notorious criminal cases to occupy the attention of the English judicial system in recent memory. The courtroom proceedings, conducted in the assizes at the county town with appropriately solemn ceremony, attracted considerable attention from the press and from the general public, whose fascination with crimes of extraordinary calculated malignity appeared to transcend the ordinary bounds of morbid curiosity and suggested something approaching a fundamental human compulsion to witness and comprehend the mechanisms by which ostensibly civilized individuals could descend into systematic predation. Whimsy, having been subpoenaed as a material witness regarding the discovery of evidence and the reconstruction of events leading to Mabel's apprehension, found himself obliged to spend several days in the witness box, articulating his deductions with a precision that seemed to both illuminate and considerably unsettle the assembled jurors, who appeared to grapple with the notion that criminal methodology could be deduced through the observation of seemingly trivial details: teacups, timelines, the faint olfactory traces of botanical poisons. Mabel herself presented a curious figure throughout the proceedings, maintaining an appearance of complete emotional detachment that suggested her psychological connection to the crimes she had perpetrated had been severed by some form of internal rupture that transcended the ordinary mechanisms of denial or psychological defense. She sat in the dock with the posture of a woman attending a theatrical performance in which she possessed some tangential interest, but no emotional investment, her gaze occasionally drifting toward the gallery, where the Reverend sat with the expression of one bearing a burden that no single trial or legal proceeding could adequately address or ameliorate. The testimony of the prosecution proceeded with methodical precision, establishing through forensic evidence, financial records, and the meticulous documentation of Mabel's own journal, the systematic nature of her crimes, and the calculated premeditation that animated each subsequent murder. The defense, recognizing the comprehensive nature of the evidence arrayed against their client, mounted what appeared to be a token resisting. He focused primarily upon establishing mitigating circumstances relating to Mabel's difficult personal history and the psychological deprivation she had experienced throughout her life. It was during the defense's closing arguments that something occurred which appeared to penetrate the emotional armor that Mabel had maintained throughout the trial proceedings. The defense counsel, in what appeared to be a final desperate attempt to inspire some measure of judicial mercy, addressed the court regarding the profound injustice of Mabel's circumstances. Her poverty, her lack of educational opportunity, the systematic denial of the romantic and familial connections that enriched other women's lives. He painted a portrait of a woman ground down by the indifference of a social system that offered her neither security nor dignity, and suggested that her crimes, however heinous, represented a form of psychological breakdown in response to intolerable circumstances rather than the manifestation of some inherent moral evil. It was at this juncture that Mabel, who had remained entirely silent and emotionless throughout the proceedings, rose abruptly from the dock and addressed the court with a voice that carried a peculiar intensity that seemed to command absolute attention. "I do not require your mercy or your sympathy," she said, her words directed toward the defense counsel rather than toward the judge or jury. "I did not commit these murders because society denied me opportunity or dignity. I committed them because I chose to do so, because I possessed the intelligence and the capability to accomplish what others lacked the courage or the will to attempt. I am not a victim of circumstance. I am a predator who recognized an opportunity and executed it with precision and calculation. Every woman I killed deserved to die, not because of anything they had done to me personally, but because they possessed security and comfort that they had done nothing to earn, because they occupied positions of privilege that should have belonged to those with the intelligence and capability to properly utilize them." She paused, and her gaze swept across the assembled courtroom with a quality of absolute contempt. "You seek to understand my motivations as though they were somehow comprehensible to ordinary minds. They are not. I exist on a plane of understanding and capability that transcends the limitations of conventional morality or psychological theory. I regret nothing, and I accept your verdict with the recognition that your justice system is merely the clumsy attempt of inferior minds to suppress the natural predatory instincts that characterize true superiority." The courtroom descended into a chaos of murmuring and confusion, the judge's attempts to restore order competing with the apparent shock that had gripped both the legal representatives and the assembled observers. Whimsy, observing this outburst from the witness gallery, experienced a moment of something approaching professional admiration mingled with profound distaste. Admiration for the sheer psychological audacity of Mabel's self-revelation, distaste for the transparent grandiosity and the fundamental dishonesty that underlay her professed superiority and transcendence. The jurors, who had appeared somewhat receptive to the defense's arguments regarding mitigating circumstances, now possessed a direct articulation of Mabel's own complete absence of remorse or moral constraint, and their subsequent deliberation appeared to proceed with considerably greater expedition than had previously been anticipated. Within the space of less than 3 hours, they returned with a guilty verdict on all counts: 8 murders, multiple charges of embezzlement, conspiracy to defraud, and various ancillary NSEs that collectively constituted an indictment of extraordinary comprehensiveness. The sentencing, conducted with the appropriate gravity by the presiding judge, resulted in the imposition of 8 concurrent life sentences with no possibility of parole, effectively condemning Mabel to spend the remainder of her existence within the confines of a penal institution. As she was led from the courtroom to the accompaniment of considerable press attention and public commentary, Mabel maintained her expression of absolute composure, and her final words, delivered in a voice sufficiently audible to be recorded by the assembled journalists, suggested that she had achieved a form of psychological reconciliation with her fate that transcended the ordinary mechanisms of despair or contrition. "You have confined my body," she declared, "but my mind remains forever beyond your reach, forever superior to the conventional morality and limited understanding that characterizes your entire civilization." The aftermath of Mabel's conviction and sentencing proceeded with the particular species of anticlimax that characterizes those moments when dramatic legal proceedings conclude and the machinery of ordinary life resumes its mundane operations with an indifference that seems almost callous to those who have been profoundly affected by the events that have transpired. The press, having exhausted their fascination with the salacious details of the crimes and the psychological peculiarities of the criminal, gradually redirected their attention toward matters of more immediate and transitory interest, leaving the Sussex countryside to its customary quiet and the vicarage to the solitary occupation of a man attempting to reconstruct the foundations of his faith and his understanding of the fundamental nature of human trustworthiness. Whimsy, having fulfilled his obligations to the legal proceedings, and received the expressed gratitude of both the prosecution and Inspector Hardcastle for his contributions to the successful resolution of the investigation, found himself in that peculiar state of post-investigative ennui that characteristically followed the conclusion of matters that had occupied his intellectual attention for an extended period. It was approximately 2 weeks subsequent to Mabel's sentencing that Whimsy received a communication from the Reverend Catamole, delivered by post in an envelope bearing the distinctive ecclesiastical seal of Ashford Vicarage, and containing within it a request that Whimsy return to the vicarage for purposes of what the Reverend characterized as a matter of considerable personal and spiritual significance. Whimsy, recognizing in this phrasing the particular linguistic formulae that the clergy employed when confronted with matters that exceeded their capacity for independent resolution, accepted the invitation with the resignation of a man who has learned through extensive experience that the completion of one investigation rarely precluded the emergence of complications and implications that demanded further attention and clarification. He accordingly made arrangements to depart London on the following Tuesday, arriving at the vicarage in the late afternoon when the winter light had begun its premature descent, and the Sussex landscape had assumed those qualities of grey melancholy that characterize the season in that particular region. The Reverend received him in the study where, more than a month prior, the 3 teacups had initiated their sequence of revelations, and Whimsy observed that the room appeared to have undergone a subtle but significant transformation. The side table upon which the cups had stood had been removed, and in its place stood a simple wooden cross of modest dimensions fashioned from what appeared to be yew wood, and bearing an inscription in Latin that Whimsy recognized as an ancient prayer for the repose of souls departed. The Reverend, noting Whimsy's observation of this alteration, offered a slight nod of acknowledgement before proceeding to articulate the purpose of his invitation. "I have spent the past weeks in profound spiritual distress," the Reverend began, settling himself into his chair with movements that suggested considerable weariness. "Not distress regarding Mabel's crimes or the discovery of Eleanor's murder, Lord Peter, but rather distress regarding my own fundamental comprehension of divine justice and the nature of God's mercy. You see, I have devoted my entire life to the proposition that the world operates according to comprehensible moral principles, that virtue is rewarded and vice is punished, that the universe possesses an underlying rational structure that reflects divine wisdom and benevolence. Yet the events that have transpired in my own household have forced me to confront the possibility that this entire theological architecture, may be profoundly mistaken, that evil may flourish beneath the guise of familial obligation and Christian charity, and that God's justice, if it exists at all, operates according to principles so obscure as to be effectively incomprehensible to human understanding. Wimsey settled himself into the chair opposite the Reverend with the air of a man preparing to engage in a discussion of considerable philosophical complexity. "You are experiencing what might be characterized as an acute crisis of faith," he observed, his tone suggesting neither judgment nor dismissal, but rather clinical recognition of a psychological and spiritual condition that was not uncommon among individuals who had been subjected to profound betrayal. The discovery that your wife's death was not merely the natural consequence of disease, but rather the deliberate act of someone you had extended employment and hospitality to, has forced you to confront the question of whether a benevolent deity would permit such catastrophic moral failure to occur within the sphere of his creation. It is, I confess, a somewhat challenging theological proposition. "Precisely," the Reverend agreed, his voice carrying a note of desperate intensity. "And I have determined that I can no longer serve as a clergyman while harboring such profound doubts regarding the fundamental veracity of the faith I am obliged to articulate. I have therefore submitted my resignation to the bishop, effective at the conclusion of this ecclesiastical year. I intend to withdraw from the ministry and to spend whatever years remain to me in private contemplation and the systematic examination of questions regarding faith, justice, and the nature of human suffering. I have invited you here, Lord Peter, because I believe that you possess insights regarding the nature of human evil and divine justice that might prove illuminating to my own spiritual inquiry." Wimsey was silent for a considerable interval, his gaze fixed upon the simple wooden cross that now occupied the space where the 3 teacups had previously stood. When he finally spoke, his tone carried a quality of measured precision that suggested he was articulating conclusions that had themselves been arrived at through extensive personal experience and reflection. "I have investigated perhaps 200 murders during my adult life, Reverend," he said slowly. "In that extensive exposure to human criminality, I have observed that evil rarely announces itself in dramatic fashion or manifests in forms that are immediately recognizable as fundamentally opposed to goodness. Evil typically arrives in the guise of reasonable self-interest, of justifiable grievance, of necessary expedience. Mabel Ashworth did not perceive herself as perpetrating evil. She perceived herself as rectifying injustice, as liberating herself from unjust circumstances, as asserting a form of superiority that she believed herself to possess. Yet the outcome of her actions remains profoundly evil, regardless of her subjective perception of her own motivations. Now, generate the final section of the story, ensuring a satisfying resolution. Maintain the logical progression of clues and character arcs, delivering the final reveal smoothly while keeping the ending impactful and true to the detective's style. The Reverend absorbed this articulation with the intensity of a man grasping at philosophical moorings in the midst of a spiritual tempest. His fingers gripping the arms of his chair as though physical force might somehow anchor him against the tide of existential uncertainty that had engulfed his previously stable understanding of the universe. But if evil is so ubiquitous, so fundamentally woven into the fabric of human motivation and action, what purpose does faith serve? He asked, his voice carrying the desperate quality of a man seeking reassurance that the entire structure of his life's work had not been constructed upon foundations of elaborate delusion. What is the utility of virtue or moral restraint if the universe operates according to principles that permit the systematic predation of the innocent by the malevolent? Wimsey rose from his chair and moved to the window where the darkening evening had rendered the Sussex landscape visible only as indistinct shadows and vague silhouettes. When he spoke, his tone carried neither the comfort of conventional religious platitude nor the bleakness of philosophical nihilism, but rather something that occupied a more austere and intellectually honest middle ground. "I suspect, Reverend, that the utility of faith and virtue lies not in the expectation that they will be rewarded by a benevolent deity or that they will prevent the occurrence of evil, but rather in the fact that they represent the most sophisticated and rational response available to conscious beings confronted with a universe that appears fundamentally indifferent to human suffering and moral aspiration. The detective does not investigate murders because he expects justice to be swift or certain. He investigates because the alternative, the acceptance of systematic predation and the abandonment of rational inquiry into the mechanisms of human criminality, constitutes a form of moral abdication that is considerably more obscene than the existence of evil itself. He paused, allowing this observation to settle into the silence of the study, before continuing with a precision that suggested he was articulating conclusions that transcended mere philosophical speculation and reflected instead the hard-won wisdom of accumulated experience. Mabel Ashworth murdered 8 women, not because the universe is fundamentally unjust or because God is indifferent to human suffering, but because she possessed the capacity for evil and made the deliberate choice to exercise that capacity. That choice remains hers and hers alone, regardless of whatever psychological deprivation or social injustice she may have experienced. The existence of her criminality does not invalidate the proposition that moral restraint and ethical conduct represent rational choices that conscious beings ought to make. It merely establishes that not all beings make such choices and that evil remains a perpetual possibility within the sphere of human action. The Reverend was silent for an extended period, his gaze fixed upon the simple wooden cross that stood as testimony to both his faith and his profound uncertainty regarding that faith's ultimate validity. "Thank you." When he finally spoke again, his voice had acquired a quality of resigned acceptance that suggested he had achieved, if not precisely resolution, then at least some form of psychological equilibrium regarding the questions that had tormented him. "I shall not withdraw from the ministry," he said slowly, as though articulating this decision with considerable care. "Rather, I shall continue to serve, not from the conviction that God is just or that virtue will be rewarded, but from the recognition that the alternative, the acceptance of systematic predation and the abandonment of moral principle, constitutes a surrender to precisely the form of evil that Mabel Ashworth represents. My faith is no longer a faith in justice, Lord Peter, but rather a faith in the perpetual necessity of human resistance to evil, regardless of whether that resistance is ultimately rewarded or validated by any transcendent authority." Wimsey nodded slowly, as though acknowledging that the Reverend had arrived at conclusions that, while not entirely satisfactory from a purely philosophical standpoint, represented an appropriate compromise between the demands of intellectual honesty and the requirements of functional existence within a morally ambiguous universe. He moved toward the door, the deliberate movements of a man whose work here had been completed and whose presence was no longer materially necessary to the Reverend's ongoing process of spiritual reconstruction. Yet before departing, he paused and turned back to address the clergyman, with a final observation that seemed to encapsulate the entire essence of his investigation and its implications. "The third teacup," he said, his tone suggesting that he was referencing an object that had acquired significance far exceeding its physical materiality, served as the mechanism through which an elaborate crime was ultimately exposed and resolved. Yet it was merely a teacup, Reverend, a simple vessel designed to contain beverage and nothing more. Its significance derived entirely from the context in which it was placed and the questions that its very existence compelled us to ask. Evil operates in precisely the same fashion. It presents itself as comprehensible within ordinary frameworks of motivation and action, yet upon closer examination, it reveals dimensions of depravity and calculation that exceed the ordinary bounds of human criminality. Your task, as you continue your ministry, is not to explain or rationalize this evil, but rather to recognize it for what it is, and to maintain the perpetual vigilance that such recognition demands. With these final words, Wimsey extended his hand to the Reverend in a gesture of cordial dismissal, and proceeded to depart the vicarage with the satisfied air of a man who had successfully resolved not merely the mechanical aspects of a criminal investigation, but who had also contributed, however modestly, to the spiritual and psychological restoration of an individual whose faith had been severely tested by exposure to the systematic predation and calculated malignity that evil, when sufficiently motivated and adequately resourced, could perpetrate upon the innocent. As his automobile disappeared into the gathering darkness of the Sussex evening, the Reverend remained standing in the study, his gaze fixed upon the simple wooden cross that now bore silent testimony to his determination to maintain faith not in cosmic justice, but in the perpetual necessity of human moral resistance to evil, a faith that, while perhaps less metaphysically satisfying than the theological certainties of his earlier years, possessed the considerable advantage of being grounded in rational acknowledgement of the actual nature of the world in which he inhabited, and the genuine capacity of conscious beings to choose virtue, despite its lack of guaranteed reward or divine validation. And, in this fashion, the matter of the third teacup, and all that it signified regarding the nature of human evil and the requirements of moral vigilance, came to its ultimate and perhaps most profound conclusion.